You're listening to Drug Positive, the risk reduction and benefit enhancement podcast, reducing shame and stigma to save lives and end the drug war. Hi everyone, I'm back, and once again I know it's been a long time since my last episode, and I'm not even going to apologize this time because in the end it just gets ridiculous. All I'm going to say is that I do intend to produce episodes more regularly, and I will at some point, but so much has been happening in my life, it's crazy. I'll tell you a bit about it briefly, and then we'll get into the episode, which is about COVID and festivals. Basically, when are festivals likely to start happening again? But first, about me. Here's what's going on. A few months ago, in my last episode, I told you about my mom and her dementia. And thank you everyone who wrote me with your sympathy and your words of encouragement, and those who asked me how she's been doing. It's actually quite interesting. She's doing maybe 70% better. But she does still have dementia. So it wasn't all about the medication that she was on. If you remember, I was hopeful that her problems were all related to this one medication called pramipexole, and that once I got her doctors to discontinue it, I was hopeful that she would get better. And she did seem to for a couple of days. And that's when I recorded my last episode. But it ended up not being that. She got worse again. It was about another whole month before she improved to this point where she is right now. But here's the thing. I believe it was the COVID that fucked with her brain, and that during those few months she had it, it was responsible for wiping out her short-term memory. I mean, she couldn't remember what we spoke about from moment to moment. She'd literally say the exact same things over and over again, not realizing it. But when she finally beat the COVID, she slowly got better, like 70% better, which is huge. And that just doesn't happen with typical Alzheimer's. With typical Alzheimer's, it's a steady downhill. You don't get better like that. You may have good days and bad days, but her improvement has been dramatic. I really have to say my mom is back. We talk at least every 2 or 3 days, and I plan to visit her as soon as I'm allowed to travel internationally, and as soon as I get a vaccine. She just got her first shot, by the way, just a few days ago. She's in a care home in England, remember? And the fatality rate there is the highest in the world right now. So I'm really happy she got her first vaccine. But here's why I think the COVID affected her so much, her brain. And that is that this virus can strike anywhere in the body. And we know there's a lot of cases of people who get cognitive problems when they get COVID. Some that last quite a long time. Like you've all heard of post-COVID brain fog. Like there's a lot of people talking about that. But there's also COVID psychosis. Seriously, some people who get COVID literally become psychotic. As in full-on schizophrenia type psychotic. It doesn't seem to be permanent, but these are people with no history of mental illness. Totally weird. So anyway, we know the virus can affect the brain, and it can also produce lots of different symptoms kind of everywhere or anywhere in the body. And so here's my theory. What I think is that some of these non-standard symptoms that some people get, meaning more than a cough and a fever and the regular stuff, depends on particularly where that person might be experiencing inflammation, pre-existing inflammation. So it's like everyone has some degree of inflammation, right? There's so many toxins in our environment these days, so many foreign things getting into our bodies, and our immune system tries to recognize and attack them. But sometimes it gets confused and attacks our own tissues instead. And this can cause chronic pain and disease. Inflammation is so common, in fact, that we take it for granted. It's the number one cause of pain and illness by far. When it gets way out of hand, people get diagnosed with autoimmune disorders like ALS, multiple sclerosis, arthritis, you name it. There's so many. But for the vast majority of us, inflammation kind of remains mild. So we just take ibuprofen on occasion. But the thing is, it tends to strike in the same place when it does. So wherever a person might get inflammation, that's generally where it stays. And so Alzheimer's is correlated with brain inflammation. My mom was already in the early stages of Alzheimer's when she got COVID, which means she already had some inflammation happening in her brain. Then she got COVID and her main symptoms were in her brain, a total loss of short-term memory. So I think what's going on is that her immune system was already primed to attack the neurons in her brain. So when she got COVID, the cytokines that attack foreign invaders and that cause inflammation mainly went there. And they went to town there. So I think that COVID is more likely to affect areas in your body if you already have inflammation going on there. Anyway, that's my theory. And that's my mom. She's doing so much better now. So thank you again, everyone who wrote to me with your love and support. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I have my mom back. Let me just say one more thing before I move on from this. If you remember my last episode, I gave you a list of things you can do to prevent dementia. Well, I want to add one more thing to that list, and it's important, and that is eat more fiber. You see, fiber feeds the good bacteria in your colon that excrete anti-inflammatory molecules that prevent brain inflammation, molecules that sweep up cytokines, keeping them in balance. And Alzheimer's is highly correlated with low levels of these molecules. This could be why Alzheimer's is on the rise, especially in the West, because our diets suck and we don't get enough fiber. So what are these bacteria in our colon that we need to keep happy? Well, the first thing to know is that they're not Acidophilus and Bifidus. Those are good bacteria also, and you can buy those in a supplement form and eat them. But we're talking about different bacteria here. Bacteria lower down in your colon, and they don't come in supplements. So how do you increase them if you can't eat them? And the answer is you feed them. Well, you could also get a fecal transplant if you want, where they stick some healthier person's poop up your butt. And yes, this is actually a thing, but we won't go there right now. An easier way to increase the number of these good bacteria in your colon is simply to eat fiber, because that's what they live on. So eat more vegetables, feed those good bugs in your poop, and they will reward you by pooping out anti-inflammatory molecules, which will help you prevent dementia later in life. No joke. And remember, exercise and take your psychedelics regularly also. So another reason I haven't put out any new episodes in a few months is that just a few weeks after my last episode, I had to go to Florida because the pandemic basically killed my family business down there, and we had to shut it down. It's a dry cleaners, and it's been in my family since 1937. My sister and I inherited it when our father passed away in 2012, and it's always made a decent amount of money. But when COVID hit, people stopped going into the office for work, and so they stopped wearing dry cleanable clothes. And we immediately lost 60% of our business, and it hasn't improved at all for this whole year. So basically we had to close it, and I've been dealing with that, which has been a lot of work. But at the same time, I want to tell you something really good that's happened in my life. And that is, I've met someone super awesome. Her name is Becky, and she lives in Michigan. She's a friend of mine, and we started chatting back in September, and we really hit it off, and so we've been spending time together. She actually flew down to Florida when I was there and stayed with me in my RV, and we took a trip around Florida, and I just recently drove her back to Michigan, where she lives and where I am right now. So in the middle of all this trauma and death and financial collapse and no festivals, something actually really good happened to me in 2020. Anyway, that's what's been happening with me. Now, we'll get into the episode. When are festivals going to happen again? And let me say first, I'm talking about commercial festivals. I'm not talking about small private events. I'm talking about the big festivals we all love, with music and drugs and porta potties and thousands or tens of thousands of people. I miss them so much. The last festival I attended was Halloween in Florida back in October 2019. And the last indoor concert I saw was Mark Farina in El Paso. in early March, like first week of March in 2020, just before COVID hit. I took 2CB. Holy shit, we danced for hours in a packed nightclub, wall to wall with tons of sweaty strangers. I mean, if anyone had COVID that time, we all would have gotten it. But it was so much fun. Dancing to music on psychedelics with others. It's my medicine, like it is for a lot of people. And really, we haven't been able to do that in a year. And people are suffering because of it. Depression and mental illness are skyrocketing. The stats all prove that. Not just because of a lack of festivals, but the entire social distancing phenomena. But I miss live music and dancing in groups. Dancing alone just isn't the same thing. And recorded music isn't the same as live music. Seriously, there's evolutionary biological reasons for this. I'm actually going to do a podcast episode about it one day. Humans' ability to appreciate music evolved in us for social bonding purposes. It's really important for our mental health. I miss festivals for another reason too. And that is, usually, I attend festivals with DanceSafe, the nonprofit I founded 22 years ago. And I spent a lot of time at festivals at the DanceSafe booth testing drugs for people. We actually just had finished fundraising for 2 spectroscopy machines that we were going to start bringing to festivals with us. These machines shoot a laser into the powder, and because every molecule reflects a different spectrum of light, it can tell every drug in the sample with precision. Super cool drug checking technology. And right when we got the money to buy them, boom, COVID ends festivals. The last DanceSafe event, I believe, was Gem and Jam in Arizona last February. I'm also worried about our chapters. The DanceSafe national office is doing okay. People are still buying test kits, but because there's no festivals, our local chapters around the country have nothing to do. And I'm really worried if this situation lasts another year, we may have to start all over again organizing local chapters. The festival culture, our festival culture, is beautiful, and I miss it so much. When are they going to start up again? That's what I'm going to talk about now. And of course, it's all about the pandemic. So I'm going to get into the science of COVID. Virology, immunology, epidemiology. It's kind of taken over my intellectual life this past year. I've been a non-stop COVID researcher. It's actually one of the reasons I decided to do this episode, to kind of get it out of my system. And maybe then I can get back to making podcast episodes about drugs. But anyway, here's the main thing about when festivals will happen again. They won't happen again until they're safe. Until they won't become super spreader events that lead to deadly COVID outbreaks. This actually applies to all mass gatherings. The most dangerous events of all, the ones that lead to the most fatalities in the long run, are large mass gatherings. Because you've got thousands of strangers coming together, and then they go back to their respective communities, spreading the virus around the country. So when will mass gatherings no longer lead to deadly COVID outbreaks? The general answer to this, or where the discussion begins, is when enough people are vaccinated. It's more complicated than that, but let's start with that. Let me tell you about the vaccines first. And the main thing to know about the 2 current vaccines out there, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, is that they likely won't prevent you from getting infected with COVID and spreading it to others. They will only prevent you from getting a severe systemic infection. Fauci and the media aren't really talking about this too much. I think they don't want to turn people off from getting the vaccine, so they aren't saying anything that could be seen as negative. But most virologists doubt that the vaccines will prevent infections and transmissions completely. Why? It has to do with the route of administration mainly. The vaccines are injected into your arm. They contain messenger RNA that cause the muscle cells in your arm to temporarily produce molecules that resemble parts of the coronavirus spike protein. These molecules then stimulate your immune system to produce antibodies, which then circulate in your blood. But antibodies don't easily get into the epithelial cells in your upper respiratory tract. So what they think is that the coronavirus will likely still be able to take hold there, infect the cells in your nose and throat, and start to multiply, and then you can still breathe those particles out and infect others around you. Immunologists have actually known about the importance of vaccine route of administration for a long time. It's the reason why the later polio vaccine was oral rather than injected. You see, the first polio vaccine prevented severe illness, paralysis, and death, but it didn't prevent people from actually getting polio and passing it on to others. And this is because the antibodies had a hard time reaching the epithelial cells in the gut, where polio first strikes. Polio is spread from feces. The virus particles in feces can get onto food and water in a number of ways, and then when someone else ingests them, they bind to the epithelial cells in the intestines, where the antibodies don't reach very well. Epithelial cells, by the way, are the cells that divide the inside of us from the outside of us, like skin cells. They're at the periphery. They're the farthest place from blood flow. So when scientists realized this was happening, they developed the second polio vaccine that you swallow from weakened polio virus. So when you swallowed those virus particles in the oral vaccine, they hit the epithelial cells in the gut first, stimulating a direct, localized immune memory right where it needs to be. An immune response that involves T cells and B cells, which I'll talk about soon. But the oral vaccine is the only reason we've pretty much eliminated polio from the world today. Not entirely, but almost. So you might ask, why not make a COVID vaccine that you can inhale or squirt up your nose? Well, the answer to that is that it's too dangerous. Inhaled or insufflated vaccines in the animal studies cause too much inflammation. Many of the animals have died, or they develop breathing problems, severe complications. So we're nowhere close to getting an upper respiratory tract administered vaccine. It's going to be an injection in the arm, and so it's likely only going to prevent severe COVID infections. So we're not going to see vaccine festival passports. In other words, we're not going to see festivals where you can go if you have proven you've gotten a vaccine. Because even though you and other attendees won't be likely to get severely sick if you get infected, you're still likely to be able to get infected and then pass it on to other people. So what that means is we really do need to see enough people vaccinated, as in at least a few 100 million in the United States, before mass gatherings are going to be safe. And you know, everyone's talking about this 80% figure to reach herd immunity, but herd immunity is a dubious concept with coronaviruses. There is no herd immunity with any of the other coronaviruses, ones that produce colds, despite them being around for thousands of years and the entire population getting infected multiple times. And that's because it seems like antibodies for coronaviruses typically fade away rapidly. And we're finding the same thing is true with this coronavirus. It looks like antibodies for severe infections last only about 6 months, maybe more, maybe less for some people. But there's already been hundreds of documented cases of people who have gotten COVID twice. There's no herd immunity with the flu either, right? So COVID, like the flu and like other coronaviruses, may never go away. We may never eradicate it. I think that's likely. And if not, there's never going to be herd immunity, right? Despite what the media is saying. We'll just have to learn to live with it, like the flu. This is seriously something we should consider. And it's probably likely. One piece of good news here is that there is some T cell and B cell adaptive immune system memory that happens with natural COVID infections, involving not just antibodies. And that may mean that over time, subsequent infections get less and less severe. Some virologists think that that's what's happened with other coronaviruses, the other common colds. They may have begun with a more deadly virus and then over time became milder and milder. So that may happen with this coronavirus too. We don't know. But either way, if that is true, it would definitely take a long time. The better news is that the vaccines do seem to work well in preventing severe infections. So, if enough people get vaccinated, and if it confers this immunity to severe infection for long enough, then festivals should be able to start up again. Which leads to the question, how long will it take to assess whether this is actually happening? But before I get to that, let's talk first about the potential problem of all those people out there who aren't going to get the vaccine. People have various reasons for being skeptical of the vaccine, but in general, there's two large groups, and this is from national surveys. The first large group are Republicans, a large percentage of Republicans, Trump supporters most likely. The second large group are African Americans, and the reasons these two groups are skeptical of the vaccines are probably different, but they're both because of political beliefs rather than science. Republicans are generally more opposed to public health because they see individual liberty as paramount. And African Americans have a long history of being experimented on medically, including vaccines, which is a horrible history, and I won't get into it here, but that's caused some skepticism in a large percentage of the Black community. And of course, you also have some people who are skeptical of the COVID vaccines for scientific reasons, but that's a much smaller number of people. The first two groups are by far the largest. And so how many people are we talking about in these groups? How many people might actually refuse to get a COVID vaccine? And how's that going to impact the reopening of festivals? Well, surveys show it's about a quarter of the population, maybe up to a third. So we're talking 25 to 33%, which puts us somewhere close to the 80% mark that Fauci and other public health people are talking about that we need for pretend herd immunity. Remember, I call it pretend because, again, if they don't prevent infections and transmissions, but just severe infection, then there's going to be no herd immunity, right? But anyway, nobody knows whether we'll get to that 80% of the population vaccination threshold. And so will we be able to open festivals if we don't? Also, I don't think the vaccine will be mandatory. A lot of people are worried about that. I don't think that's going to happen, at least not for many years. There are mandatory vaccines, of course, measles and others, but I can't see the government making COVID vaccines mandatory until they've had a long enough track record of safety and efficacy. Plus, COVID doesn't kill very many children, so unvaccinated people aren't really jeopardizing children, and that's an important piece of this. Also, the vaccine may not prevent transmissions, and so unvaccinated people may be no different in this regard than vaccinated people. Anyway, the point is just that I don't think there's going to be mandatory vaccines, so how many people will we need to voluntarily get a COVID vaccine to prevent festivals from causing deadly outbreaks? And that's hard to answer, but it also might be the wrong question anyway, because I think that once the vaccines have been around long enough for anyone who wants to get one to be able to get one, then at some point we just got to say that anyone who refuses to get vaccinated is pretty much only putting themselves at risk. I mean, they're making that choice, right? And it doesn't really impact others that much, right? Children aren't at a high risk, and the vaccines themselves are unlikely to stop transmission. So one would think that at some point down the line, when the vaccines have been available long enough to everyone who wants one, and if they remain as safe as they appear to be now, and as effective, if they prevent severe infection for a long enough time, say at least a year, then even if a quarter or a third of the population refuses to get one, at that point, we should be able to have festivals again, right? Well, maybe. But I think the real determining factor, I've been saving this, is going to be the numbers. And I'll wait a little bit more to talk about that. But before I get into that, I do want to talk about how COVID is transmitted and how infections happen and how someone can protect themselves and others from severe infection. Because one big part of this is, right, staying outdoors. And so you would think that because festivals are outdoors, mostly the ones that we're talking about, they might be able to happen sooner than indoor mass gatherings, at least, right? I personally think being outdoors with 6 feet of space between people and with masks is 100% safe. And so this theoretically means outdoor music gatherings can happen right now, safely, if they mandate proper social distancing. And even some are doing that. But it's more complicated than that, because these aren't very large outdoor gatherings. They're small events. I really don't think large festivals could accomplish this. There's just too many people. The dance floors are too crowded. Keep in mind, it only takes about 15 minutes to become infected if you're standing outdoors within 6 feet of someone who's shedding without a mask. That's at least what the CDC defines as exposure. 15 minutes next to someone outdoors. So there's just no way people are going to be able to stay that far apart from one another at a festival. Masks might prolong the time it takes to get exposure, but again, we're talking about people dancing in front of a stage, which means they're breathing way more heavily than they normally do, and people never keep their masks on all the time anyways, and you can't enforce it. And then you get the whole porta potty thing. So I don't think it's possible to have socially distanced music festivals with tens of thousands of people. It just doesn't apply to the kind of large festivals we're talking about. So let's talk a bit more specifically about how COVID is transmitted. The first thing to know is that the virus is airborne. And the vast majority of transmissions happen from breathing it in, maybe even all of them. Because there isn't a single known case of surface transmission. I'm not going to say it can't happen, but it's just never been documented. So it's not nearly as important to wash your hands as it is to avoid contaminated air. Restaurants that disinfect their surfaces but don't have ventilation and air filters aren't doing you any good. It's just theater. And make no mistake, this virus is airborne in every meaning of that term. It can become fully aerosolized and float around all by itself in the air, and it can float around inside micro droplets that come out of people's nose and mouth when they breathe, and especially when they talk. And it was a scandal that it took the World Health Organization until the summer, I think it was even late summer, to finally admit that this virus was airborne. But that's another story. I don't want to get into the politics too much here. The good news is that one particle isn't going to get you sick. You need to breathe in a large enough dose of this virus to actually get infected. Exactly how much, as in how many particles? Well, nobody knows that. And doing studies on this, which they call challenge studies, would be unethical. You can't just dose people on various levels of the virus and see who gets sick or not. So we won't know those exact numbers, but there's a lot of evidence that the dose you get really matters. And this is really important. I want to walk you through, exactly how an infection happens. So say you're standing close to someone without a mask and they're infected and shedding, or say you're indoors where there are virus particles floating in the air everywhere and you're breathing them in and out of your lungs. Okay, now depending on how many you breathe in, some of them will get trapped in the mucous membranes of your nose, in your sinus cavities, and in your throat. Possibly some even get trapped in your upper bronchi, but that's far less likely because there isn't a lot of mucus in your lungs, so you're just going to breathe those out. Now, some of the particles will just die in the mucous membranes right where they are, but some will make their way through the mucus to the epithelial cells below them. And then they'll attach to ACE2 receptors where they can enter the cell. And if they do get in, the virus hijacks your DNA and gets your cells to start making more virus particles. At least that's what the virus wants to do. And if it gets that far, it's called an infection. But there's a chance, if you get a light enough exposure, that your killer T cells will kill all the virus before they start replicating. Killer T cells can recognize when a cell in your body has a virus attached to its surface, and then they kill the cell. Killer T cells are an important part of our immune system. They don't kill the virus itself, they kill cells infected with the virus, and they can kill them quickly. They're the first line of defense. They can kill them potentially even before the cell starts replicating the virus. So this means you can get exposed to this coronavirus without getting infected if it's a light enough dose. And this can stimulate an adaptive immune response in your T cells, which may be helpful later on if you get exposed again. And you can also get mildly infected, where the virus does start replicating, but it never spreads very far. It never leaves your upper respiratory tract. And in fact, most infections appear to be mild like this. The killer T cells kill the infected cells quickly, and antibodies kill the rest of the virus directly before any other cells become infected. To be specific, you've got killer T cells, right, that recognize when one of your cells has a virus attached to it, and then it kills the cell. Then you have helper T cells, which recognize the virus and tell B cells to create antibodies for it. The B cells create the antibodies, which then bind to the virus and mark it for destruction, and then other immune cells come along and destroy it. So it's a little complicated. Again, you've got killer T cells and helper T cells, B cells that make the antibodies, and then a bunch of other cells called cytokines that come along and kill any virus that has an antibody attached to it. You don't really need to remember all this. The important takeaway is just that most infections are resolved naturally by T cells, B cells, and antibodies in the upper respiratory tract. And some exposures are resolved by T cells even before any antibodies are produced. And that's good news, obviously, so long as you get a light enough exposure. But you're not out of the woods just because you got exposed once and had a mild case, or were asymptomatic. Having a mild or asymptomatic infection is a factor both of the state of your general health and your immune system, as well as the amount of virus you were initially exposed to. The second time around, you might get a gigantic exposure, which could overwhelm your immune system. We really don't know how this is going to play out yet. It's still too early. But the point is, just like with drugs, dose matters. So even if you're older or have pre-existing health conditions that make you more vulnerable to a severe reaction, if you get a small enough initial dose, you may be okay. And the reverse is also true. Even if you're young and healthy with no pre-existing conditions, if you get a massive initial dose, like say you're on a cruise ship, say you're on Jam Cruise, and 20 people on the ship are shedding the virus, and all the air is being recirculated and you're breathing in virus particles with every breath. That many virus particles could overwhelm your T cells and B cells and antibodies and might make you sick or kill you even if you're healthy. Scientists call the initial dose the viral inoculum, how much of the virus you get inoculated with. This is different than viral load, which is the maximum amount of virus in your body at a given time during the course of your infection after it has started replicating. Viral inoculum is the reason indoor locations are the most dangerous places you can be, and it's why fatalities are skyrocketing now during the winter, because people are spending more time indoors. Also, the cold and dry air tends to evaporate respiratory droplets faster, releasing the virus in the air and making it airborne more quickly before the droplet can fall down to the ground and bring the virus down with it. So winter increases not only transmissions, but the average dose that people get, leading to more fatalities and raising the case fatality ratio. This is why I try not to share indoor space with anyone outside my quarantine, which right now means just me and Becky. And this is also why masks remain so important. Masks reduce the amount of virus that gets into you and out of you that can infect others. Remember those cruise ships early on, Diamond Princess and others, where tons of people were dying? The case fatality rates on those ships were enormous, like 15%. Then we had the initial lockdown, and then later some cruises started up again, but with mask mandates. So on these masked cruises later on that had outbreaks, the results are telling. They had pretty much the same percentage of infections, but the case fatality rate was far lower. Far few people were dying. And this is because masks reduced the amount of virus people were getting exposed to. They reduced the viral inoculum. So even though they got infected, they were less likely to die. And this is just one of the many pieces of evidence that masks really do work. I don't know how you're going to convince your naysaying friends about this, because I think their opposition is mostly political. But anyway, masks do work. Back to festivals, though. When are they going to happen? I think with all the science I just explained, as well as a sizable percentage of the population skeptical of the vaccines, unfortunately, it's going to be a while. They're definitely not going to happen this year. Fauci says we may have enough vaccines rolled out for everyone by the end of summer, maybe. And technically that's before Burning Man. It's before Halloween. But I really don't think they're going to happen, because even if we get 75 or 80% of the population vaccinated by then, and I don't think we will, but even if we do, we still don't know how long the vaccines work. What if they only last 6 months, like natural antibodies? So I think we need to know this first, and other things. And so the real measure here is the numbers. What's really going to decide when mass gatherings can happen again are when we see the rate and number of COVID deaths drop significantly and stay down for a long time. Only the data is going to demonstrate whether the vaccines are working. Steady declining numbers. So how many daily deaths do we need to get down to, and for how long? Well, I don't know, but consider this. In a bad flu year, we have maybe 50,000 deaths. We're going on 500,000 deaths in the first year with COVID. And that's even with all the social distancing we're doing. Without social distancing, epidemiologists have predicted we would have seen many millions of deaths. So I'd say we're going to need to see fatalities get down to at least 100,000 a year or fewer, or about 275 deaths a day, before anyone thinks that we have this pandemic under control. That's a death rate about twice that of the worst flu year. So if the national fatality rate can get down to 275 deaths per day and stay there for, say, 6 months at least, I'd venture to say festivals will start up again. And for sure, that's not going to be until at least the summer of 2022, at the earliest. Keep in mind also that other things are going to reopen first, like movie theaters, long before mass gatherings happen. But if the fatality rate stays low during this reopening process, festivals and mass gatherings will follow. In fact, they'll probably symbolize the end of the pandemic. When they happen is the time the whole country is going to be celebrating. So, can we keep our culture together that long? I don't know. I don't know if it's together right now. We may need to start over to some degree. DanceSafe will likely need to create new chapters from scratch. And what about all the other folks in the industry? Vendors, medical teams. A lot of them went out of business. A lot of people have new jobs already. And with no profits for 2 years, will promoters even have the capital to hire enough staff right away? Seriously, it might take a while to rebuild our culture back up. But we will do it, right? I mean, it's our culture. We love the music. We love the dancing. We love the drugs. We love music and dancing and drugs together with other people. It's medicine. It's in our genes. Nobody's ever been able to stop music and dancing and drugs. So be patient, everyone. We'll get there eventually. Right now, we just need to stay safe.